Canada is often seen as calm, stable, and quietly prosperous. But underneath that calm surface, a very different story is unfolding, one that economists are beginning to watch much more closely. Before we get into it, if you enjoy deep dive economic breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and keeps you updated on global economic shifts that most people completely miss. Now here's the uncomfortable question. Is Canada quietly becoming a warning sign for other advanced economies? On paper, Canada is still a high-income, developed nation. But when you dig deeper, you start to see a mix of housing pressure, productivity challenges, rising household debt, and long-term structural changes that are slowly reshaping its economic future. And while Canada is not in a crisis today, it may be one of the clearest examples of what happens when long-term economic imbalances are allowed to build up for decades without a full reset. Let's start with the global context that set everything in motion. Canada did not collapse during the 2008 financial crisis the way the United States did, largely because its banking system was more conservative, and its housing market was not as aggressively overheated at the time. In fact, Canada actually came out of the crisis relatively stable and even benefited from the global rebound in commodity demand, especially from China, which supported its resource-driven sectors. But that stability came with an unintended consequence that only became visible years later. Because while other countries went through deeper corrections and painful restructuring after 2008, Canada largely avoided a full reset in its housing market and credit cycle. And that set the foundation for what came next, a long period of easy credit conditions, rising asset prices, and gradually increasing dependence on real estate. When interest rates were lowered globally after the crisis, Canada's housing market didn't just recover, it accelerated far beyond its fundamentals. And this is where the deeper shift begins. Over time, Canadians increasingly began to view housing not just as shelter, but as the single most important wealth-building tool available to the average household. In many cases, it became the dominant form of investment, retirement planning, and long-term financial security all rolled into one. That mindset created a powerful feedback loop that became self-reinforcing. Higher prices attracted more buyers pushed prices higher, and rising prices reinforced the belief that housing could only go up. Eventually, housing stopped behaving like a basic necessity and started behaving like a financial asset class. And to understand how extreme this has become, consider this. Home prices in Canada have risen several times faster than household incomes over the past 2 decades. At the same time, household debt tied to real estate has climbed to levels that now exceed Canada's entire GDP. That is not just high leverage, it is a structural dependency built into the core of the economy. And once an economy becomes dependent on rising asset prices to maintain stability, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse without triggering widespread financial and political consequences. Because in Canada's case, the majority of households are homeowners, which means rising property values are widely perceived as rising personal wealth. So any policy that reduces housing prices is not just an economic adjustment, it is also seen as a direct loss in household net worth for millions of voters. That creates a very difficult political reality. Governments must constantly balance affordability for younger generations against stability for existing homeowners. Now layer in another major issue, productivity. Compared to the United States, Canada produces significantly less economic output per worker. And even after adjusting for working hours, the gap remains persistent and meaningful. This is not about effort or work ethic. Canadians are not simply working less or working worse. The difference lies in what the economy invests in and how capital is allocated across sectors. The United States channels enormous amounts of capital into scaling businesses, advanced technology, infrastructure expansion, and high-growth industries that directly increase productivity over time. Canada, by contrast, has increasingly directed a large share of capital into housing and financial assets rather than productive business investment. And that distinction is critical because long-term economic growth is driven not by asset inflation, but by productivity growth. Economists often break production into 3 core inputs: labor, land, and capital. Labor refers to the workforce and its skills. Land refers to natural resources and geography, and capital refers to the machinery, infrastructure, and technology that make labor more efficient. Canada still performs well in labor quality and has abundant natural resources, but its capital allocation into high-productivity sectors has lagged behind more innovation-driven economies. Over time, that leads to slower business formation, weaker innovation pipelines, and wage growth that becomes increasingly tied to housing rather than productivity gains. There is also a structural shift that has been building quietly in the background. Industries like natural resources and manufacturing, which once formed the backbone of the Canadian economy, now make up a much smaller share of GDP than they did decades ago. Meanwhile, services, real estate, and financial activity have expanded significantly in importance. This is not unique to Canada, but the concentration is stronger and the consequences are more visible. Because it creates an economy that grows in paper wealth and asset values, but not necessarily in productive capacity or industrial strength. Now add demographics into the equation. Canada has an aging population, which increases healthcare spending while reducing the proportion of working-age citizens who contribute to economic output. To offset this, immigration has become a central policy tool designed to sustain labor supply and population growth. And in many ways, it succeeds. New arrivals fill critical labor shortages and support overall demand in the economy. But it also introduces a new pressure point, especially in housing markets that are already supply constrained. More people entering the system means more demand for housing, and when supply cannot adjust quickly, prices rise even further. At the same time, younger Canadians increasingly face higher barriers to homeownership, which deepens generational inequality and widens the wealth gap between age groups. There is also another important dynamic at play: talent migration. A significant number of skilled Canadians move to the United States in search of higher wages, stronger career progression, and more dynamic industries, particularly in technology and finance. And many of these individuals do not return, which slowly drains high-end human capital from the economy over time. This reinforces the productivity gap even further, because the most mobile and skilled workers are often the ones most likely to leave. So Canada ends up in a balancing act where almost every policy trade-off has a competing downside. It needs immigration to sustain growth, but immigration increases housing pressure. It needs housing stability, but housing is the main store of wealth for most households. It needs productivity growth, but capital continues to flow into real estate instead of innovation. And each of these problems feeds into the others in a tightly connected cycle. Even policy responses become extremely difficult to execute. Restricting housing speculation risks financial instability, tightening immigration slows labor supply, and raising interest rates can damage heavily indebted households. So every solution carries meaningful trade-offs that are both economically and politically sensitive. On top of that, external pressure matters too. Canada's economy is deeply integrated with the United States, its largest trading partner by far, which means shifts in U.S. policy, trade conditions, or industrial strategy can have immediate spillover effects. And in the background of all this is a growing infrastructure challenge, especially in colder and more remote regions where construction and maintenance costs are significantly higher than global averages. Addressing these issues would require sustained long-term investment, but fiscal capacity is not unlimited. So what happens next becomes the central question. The optimistic scenario is that Canada gradually rebalances, investing more into productivity, increasing housing supply, diversifying away from real estate dependence, and strengthening long-term wage growth. The pessimistic scenario is that current trends continue, with rising housing inequality, slower productivity growth, increasing debt burdens, and growing pressure on younger generations. Neither outcome happens quickly, because these are slow-moving structural forces that take decades to fully reverse. But they matter deeply, because they shape the long-term direction of one of the world's most stable and developed economies. Before you go, if you found this breakdown useful, make sure to subscribe for more real-world economic analysis that cuts through the noise. And finally, if you want to explore tools, resources, or products mentioned in the description, check the links below the video. Because understanding the economy is not just about watching what is happening now, it is about seeing where things are heading before the rest of the world catches up.